You know who's coming up here next when you see me here? Lou never lets me introduce any Americans. As I look around this room and I see all the different faces, and I can't imagine all the different degrees people have here and they have achieved out through the years, either from higher learning or from life experiences or from whatever. As for myself, I have a BS degree from a local university. My biggest problem is that anybody that knows me never associates the S with science. I could say too that Joseph Pearce, all on his own, has probably accrued more letters after his name than just about all of us here together. Just to give a few examples. Joseph Pearce, NF, National Front. Joseph Pearce, Ulster Defence Association, UDA. Ulster Volunteer Force member, or sympathizer, UVS. Joseph Pearce, OO, Orange Order. Joseph Pearce, he even used this one twice, SH, skinhead, also soccer hooligan. On his own native soil, of the about 186 countries in the world when he grew up, Joseph was against 179 of them. One group he didn't mention that he was a co-founder of was End Ireland's Endless Immigration Overseas, or EIEIO for short. Now with a resume like Joseph has, where would you expect him to end up? While teaching at a Catholic university in the United States, of course. He's got the perfect background. When Joseph was racing with the devil, especially in Northern Ireland, the Catholics were trying to stay 2 paces in front of both of them. Now, the last time I introduced Joseph, we hadn't met. Lou asked me to introduce him, and he didn't know me, and I knew some about him. After I introduced him, I didn't think he was too pleased with it. We happened to be near each other later on that day in this room. And he said to me he had the greatest urge to give me a good beating, especially around my mouth. That was at Mass. Naturally, at the kiss of peace. Even though he had been a devout Catholic for several years, I did apologize to him for bringing out some latent anti-Irish sentiments he had, and he was gracious enough to accept my apology. However, I do love his story. He reminds me a lot of St. Paul, putting you in good company. You don't deserve to be there, but I'll put you there anyway. He has always been and still is so passionate about everything he does and about his own story about God's grace achieved in him. Now, if God can knock St. Paul off a horse, he can certainly hit Joseph Pearce over the head with a chair. And he could also straighten him out with a straight jab to the face. All that is in his book, Race with the Devil. He's a prolific writer and a non-stop stream of wonderful stories and literary writings pouring from a brilliant mind. I can see him actually in the future creating interviews with more of the literary giants who have gone before us. Also, like St. Paul, Joseph, both from jail and outside, has written a lot of letters. After this introduction, I expect to receive the third letter from Joseph to John in the near future. Joseph Pearce.
I like tradition. And I saw the Irishman up here, and I said to Lou, "What's that Irishman doing at the mic?" He said, "He's just checking the mic." Anyway, John, I want to have to say that you are my favourite Irishman. And if you think that's a compliment, you don't know me. Okay, Chesterton. Does this thing move? This still work on move, doesn't it? So, Chesterton, holiness and thankfulness. So that's the subject today that Lou gave me. So I want to start on the subject of paradox. And not Chestertonian paradox, at least not at first. You know, the sort of Chestertonian paradox, two apparent contradictions that lead us to a deeper truth. Nor a Wildian paradox, the paradox of Oscar Wilde. Two apparent contradictions that shock us in some sort of iconoclastic way. Not even about divine paradox, the mysteries of the faith. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Or indeed, the ultimate paradox of the incarnation, God becoming man. Or indeed, that other great paradox, the Holy Trinity, the three and the one. What I want to begin with, if you like, are the paradoxes of nature itself. The paradoxes of nature which really should make atheists think twice about their position if they have eyes to see. This is where we're going to see where Chestertonian wonder and thankfulness comes in, because that's what they're lacking. Let's begin with a very, very deep question. Very deep question. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? Well, chicken. The chicken? Why? God created the chicken, but the egg's a chicken.
Eggs exist to propagate more chickens.
Eggs exist to propagate more chickens. Okay, so the first was the chicken, and that laid the egg. Well, that's that paradox solved enough. It was complicated. We can try another one. What came first? The nothing or the something? Something, the nothing, the something, the nothing. That much got you. What comes first? The nothing or the something? Well, this is sort of question really that atheists should be asking themselves before they pontificate anything else. Because we say, of course, God created ex nihilo, which would suggest that nothing came first, because God created from nothing. The only reason that happened was because something existed first, which was God. Well, then we have the wonderful realms of mathematics, where, you know, if the facts get in the way, make them up. I'm sorry, are there any mathematicians in here? There is one? Okay, you're scowling at me already. You're scowling at me already. by which I mean, of course, that, you know, that the numbers that God gave us, the infinitesimally small fraction to the infinitesimally large megabillion, it's not enough for the mathematicians. It's not enough. So they invent imaginary numbers, minus numbers, and from these imaginary numbers which don't exist, except it's a figment of the mathematician's imagination, these imaginary numbers which don't exist are put to practical purpose. And at least I understand this is the case, and perhaps the mathematician will let me know later if I'm wrong, is that it was through sort of imagining these imaginary numbers and thinking about them in an imaginative way, like a good poet, as all mathematicians are, then they came up with a sort of the square root of -1 and the various mathematics that came from that, leading to the electronics. So for something which was imaginary, we get something which is very, very practical and has changed the world. Well, that should make the atheist think a little bit. And of course, the mere mathematics of infinity. Just think about infinity. Mathematicians have a symbol for infinity. Well, the symbol's easy enough to see, but what exactly is infinity? Or the infinitesimal? And then we have that absolute nonsense at the heart of the whole material cosmos, by which I mean the Trinity. And we're not the Holy Trinity. I mean, every atheist knows that's nonsense. I'm talking about the Trinity that atheists believe in. You know, the oneness of space. 3 dimensions, one space, the unity of space, 3 dimensions. Or the Trinity of time, which cannot be perceived in its unity without us thinking in terms of past, present, and future. Again, you know, for us, and I think I mentioned this last year, for us as Christians, this is not a problem. God created the material cosmos, and therefore we would expect his fingerprints to be all over it, his Trinitarian fingerprints. If God is a Trinity, space is a Trinity. Surprise, surprise. If God is a Trinity, time is a Trinity. Surprise, surprise. We could go on if we want to get into metaphysics and talk about how reason is a Trinity, how love is a Trinity, how beauty is a Trinity, all of which need a subject and an object and the act between them to actually exist. But then we get also, you know, these Christians believe in weird things. God becoming man. Now that's a mystery that's bordering on the absurd. God becoming a man. But you know, it's not quite as mysterious as that deeper mystery that all atheists believe. Man becoming a man. Now, how did we get here? From nothing. Or was there something first? Or was there nothing first? How did we get here? Man becoming man to me is a much greater mystery than God becoming man, because if there's a God, presumably he's omnipotent. We're not omnipotent, but somehow we're here. That's a greater mystery. Now, who is man? That's another mystery. Who is man? Because the label that they've given us is Homo sapiens. That's a very silly label. But sapiens, of course, in Latin means wise. Anybody who knows anything about humanity, it's not the first word that springs to mind. And certainly, even the materialists don't believe that man is born wise. Wisdom is something that you may or may not acquire as time goes on. What they mean, so the label, their Latin is bad, what they really mean is not that we're wise, but that we're clever. That we're clever. We're smarter than the apes. We're the naked ape. We were clever enough to make clothes for ourselves. So the difference between cleverness and wisdom is something we need to be aware of. Tolkien, or the narrator in The Hobbit, says of goblins. Goblins make no beautiful things. Goblins make no beautiful things, but many clever ones. And he said it's not unlikely they're responsible for all the ingenious devices for killing lots of people at once that the modern world has, because explosions always delighted them. So there's a big difference between cleverness and wisdom. Chemical weapons are clever, but are they wise? So, We're not Homo sapiens. It's a silly label for us. In fact, it's a very modern label. It was first used in the early 19th century. So it's 200 years old, that label. We've stuck that label on ourselves. So wrong label by a wrong-headed generation. An older name for us was Homo viator. The man on a journey, or travelling man, or wayfaring man. Because we're all on a pilgrimage and we all have a purpose. All of us. Our lives have a purpose, and that purpose is to get to heaven. If we don't get there, we're failures. We are literally miserable losers. You might be wondering, he hasn't even mentioned Chesterton yet. Except for the adjective Chestertonian before the word paradox. I'm getting there, leading there. In fact, those of you that have read a lot of Chesterton will know that this really has been very little else but Chesterton so far, which is part of the point I'm coming to. So the Latin word for us, Homo viator. But the Greek word for us, I think in some ways, is even better. Anthropos. Those who look, or those who turn up. Those who turn up. As distinct from the rest of the animal world who don't turn up because they're slaves to instinct. I think in the past here, probably when you've spoken here 10 years, it's difficult to remember what you've said already, especially if you give other talks at other places. But I'm sure that I've told you a joke before. It's not really a joke. It sounds like the beginning of a joke, but it's not a joke. About when you take the Catholic and the Protestant and the Muslim and the Jew and the atheist and the agnostic, and you put them in a field facing east, waiting for the sunrise. Remember that? Nobody remembers it. No, just means, I'm sure I've said it here, so it means none of you are listening. That's fine. In fact, it's quite handy at the moment. So you put the Jew, the Muslim, the Catholic, Protestant, the atheist, the agnostic in a field facing east. You've orientated them literally, orients east. And it's dark. And then they see the sun rising. And as they see the sun rising, all of them feel a sense of gratitude. It's good that we're here. And then that sense of gratitude is very important, because what comes with that sense of gratitude is a desire to give thanks. It's good that we're here, so who shall we thank? And they start asking the question, well, who's responsible for the sunrise? That's how beauty is very important as a way of leading us to goodness and truth. Now though, that's fine. We have now in our field facing east, we have the Jew, the Muslim, the Catholic, Protestant, the agnostic, the atheist facing east. And we also now add another one, a cow. And the cow's there facing east too. And the sun comes up. And all of the men, all of the anthropos, I suppose, it's not the best, but boy, all look up and see the sunset. The cow continues grazing. Might be a little bit happy because it can see the grass much more easily, but it's grazing. It doesn't look up. We're the ones that look up and we see the sunrise, see the sunset. Now we'll do the same thing again. We have the Protestant, Catholic, the atheist, the agnostic, the Muslim, the Jew, the cow, and Gollum. And the sun comes up. And the first six look up and they appreciate the full sense of gratitude. The cow continues grazing, and Gollum scampers off them somewhere dark to hide. Because what Tolkien gives us in The Lord of the Rings is one of the most brilliant mirrors of our own soul when corrupted and addicted to sin. When we get to that state, we don't appreciate the light. We don't see the beauty. We have no appetite for it. Therefore, we don't feel grateful. There's no thankfulness. And we scamper off into the shadows. So, for instance, in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace has been brought up by his atheistic socialist parents. And he's a materialist, a little precocious boy, but he's a materialist. So he defines a star as just a ball of burning gas. And the response is, that's not what it is, it's what it's made of. And if you think that's all that it is, you haven't seen the star, even if you're looking at it. And this brings us now to Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde said, we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. And this is the difference. We are all in the gutter. We're all in the gutter together. We're all fallen, we're all broken, we're all sinners. But do we look up from the gutter at the stars beyond, as we're supposed to, as anthropos, men, and wonder at their meaning and the purpose of things? Or are we happy to have our face down in the gutter, wallowing in it, refusing to see anything beyond it, and being convinced that that's all there is? That ultimately divides the whole of humanity. We have a common gutterness, but we also have the freedom to look beyond the gutter, or the freedom not to, should we wish. Oscar Wilde also said, in his not quite so charming way, that men do not appreciate the sunrise because they can't pay for it. And G.K. Chesterton responded that Oscar Wilde could pay for the sunrise by not being Oscar Wilde. I think maybe sunset, actually, but there we go. Cricket does such things, Chesterton. Accuracy. But Oscar Wilde also said, in one of his characters in one of his plays, that a cynic is one who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. So yes, the cynic doesn't appreciate the sunrise because he can't pay for it. And Oscar Wilde knew that cynicism was bad, even if he gave his cynical characters, such as Lord Henry Wotton and Richard Dorian Gray, some of the funniest lines. And the difference between Chestertonian wit and Wildean wit is how we feel when we laugh. When you laugh with Chesterton, you never feel guilty, you feel good, because it's good humour. When you laugh at some of the iconoclastic things that Lord Henry Wotton says in The Picture Dorian Gray, you feel a bit guilty. Especially if you're married to my wife, who just reminds me that you're not getting to heaven as long as you find that funny. Excuse me. So all of this was a preamble to lead me, of course, to where I haven't really ever left, G.K. Chesterton. It was Chesterton who taught me to look up from the gutter. It was Chesterton who taught me to see the sunrise. It's Chesterton that taught me the beauty and necessity of wonder. I've said many times, and I said in the book Race with the Devil, there's a chapter called Surprised by Chesterton, that I owe a great debt to G.K. Chesterton. In fact, what I usually say is that under grace, I owe more to Chesterton than anything else for my conversion. And I may even go further. It's possible to go further than that, because I think in many ways, Chesterton was the agent of grace working on me for my conversion. And I've said, and will continue to say, that my first book was a biography of Chesterton, and that book was an act of thanksgiving. An act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton. But also an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God. And it was also actually an act of thanksgiving to God and Chesterton for giving me thanksgiving. For giving me gratitude. Thanksgiving for the thanksgiving, gratitude for the gratitude. I thank Chesterton for helping me to not be Oscar Wilde. And yet, you know, let's not be too hard on poor old Oscar Wilde. As it was Oscar Wilde, after all, amongst the many other good things he said, that we are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. A very important reminder to all of us, the gutter is pride, and the looking up is humility. Now, we talk about 7 deadly sins, and I'm certainly not going to argue with Holy Mother Church about there being 7 deadly sins, but really, you know, in some ways, there's only one deadly sin. That's the deadly sin that Satan had when he rebelled against God. The deadly sin that Adam and Eve had when they rebelled against God. And that's the sin of pride. Because the sin of pride is making ourselves God. And once we've made ourselves God, we give ourselves permission to commit the other 6 deadly sins. So you could in some ways see pride as the father of all sin, including the other deadly 6. In some senses, Chesterton grew up in the shadow of Oscar Wilde. And certainly Chesterton's early works, there was a reaction against the fin de siècle, a reaction against the decadence of the 1890s, which perhaps in some ways was an overreaction. He was too close to it. Because of course what we don't realise, and we need to realise, is that Oscar Wilde, for all his sins, had a lifelong love affair with the Catholic Church. He almost converted as an undergraduate in Dublin. He almost converted as an undergraduate in Oxford. He almost converted after having an interview with a priest at Brompton Oratory in London. When he came out of prison, he wanted to join a monastery. So that when he was received into the church on his deathbed, it was the consummation of a lifelong love affair. Now, it was a lifelong love affair, but he was not always a very faithful lover. He was in the gutter, but he never forgot where the stars were. I think we need to remember that. And it was Oscar Wilde who wrote in the Ballad of Reading Gaol that God's eternal laws are kind and break the heart of stone. And how else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in? But sometimes suffering is the only way that our pride can be broken. And we should just, while I'm mentioning it, by the way, these great sinners of the 19th century, wallowing in the gutter, talk about the decadent movement. Charles Baudelaire in France, who wrote a volume of poetry called Les Fleurs de Mal, the evil flowers, the flowers of sickness. That doesn't help, see. I'm using this as a watch, and it says 5 new messages. That doesn't tell me the time anymore. Can I borrow somebody's watch, so at least it gives some idea of how long I've been speaking, so I don't go on too long.
37.
37? Thank you very much. So the decadent, Charles Baudelaire wrote Les Fleurs de Mal, The Evil Flowers, and the critics said to Charles Baudelaire that having written that blasphemous volume, he had a simple choice left: the foot of the cross or the end of the barrel of a gun. Repentance, conversion, or despair and suicide. Charles Baudelaire converted on his deathbed, as Oscar Wilde would do later. Paul Verlaine, one of the great decadent poets, deserted his wife for his homosexual lover, and when his homosexual lover deserted him, shot his homosexual lover and went to prison. In prison he has a conversion experience, publishes a volume of poetry called Sagesse, Wisdom. Joris Cole-Huysmans, the decadent novelist, whose books had a profound influence on Oscar Wilde. Rather perversely, Oscar Wilde was reading one of the darkest and most decadent of Huysmans' novels, Arabur, on his honeymoon. Now, there's something a little bit strange about someone who reads a book like that on their honeymoon. There are other things you can do on your honeymoon. Like read Chesterton. But Huysmans, the novelist, ends his life in a monastery. When Oscar Wilde gets out of prison, he hears that Huysmans has entered a monastery and expresses a desire to do the same when applies, it is refused. The great decadent artist Aubrey Beardsley becomes a Catholic before he dies at a young age of tuberculosis. Ernest Dowson, the decadent poet, becomes a Catholic. Lionel Johnson, the decadent poet, becomes a Catholic. Lord Alfred Douglas, Oscar Wilde's lover, that's the right word, the person with whom Oscar Wilde was dallying that led to his downfall, also became a Catholic, made a Catholic the rest of his life. So I think what we see from this shared experience is that there's a shared gutterness in all of us, and the stars are there. And the danger, of course, of taking the dirtier of the paths, the decadent path, is that you are in danger of Golemizing yourself, so that you no longer desire the stars, no longer want to see that they're there, and when you do see them, you think they're nothing but a ball of burning gas. You've lost the sense of wonder. Another good question brings us back to Chesterton, which is where we'll leave things. What comes first? Gratitude or humility? I'm fairly sure the theologians would answer, probably correctly, humility. Because gratitude is a fruit of virtue. But I'm not disagreeing with that. Don't shoot me down as a heretic. But I think the two are so united that they're almost inseparable. That with humility comes gratitude. And with gratitude comes humility. It's almost as if they're an incarnate one, an incarnate whole. So what Chesterton tries to do is to startle us back into a sense of wonder, to shake us out of our gutterness, so that we turn around and look at the stars. So for instance, and he had a great influence, for instance, on J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien, in his famous essay on fairy stories, talks about the importance of what Tolkien calls Chestertonian fantasy. And he talks about the word Morifok. No, I did pronounce that correctly. Morifok. Mooreeeffoc. Morifok. coffee room seen from the inside of a coffee shop. And the point is, of course, this is a Chestertonian device. See things, in this case, inside out, back to front, to startle us into seeing something fresh for the first time. This was something Tolkien thought was a crucial element of Chestertonian fantasy. The other thing we've heard in Father Wilde's talk this morning of Chesterton telling us to stand on our head, to see things upside down. And the problem, of course, is if we don't do this, we don't see them at all. They become so familiar to us. We walk around with our eyes closed. We have to be shaken upside down, turned inside out, turned back to front, to remind us that there's not just the gutter, but there's the wonder of the stars. And of course, for me, one of the most marvellous psychological descriptions and spiritual descriptions of conversion. This is what Chesterton did to me. Chesterton, I was face down, head down, in the gutter. Through reading Chesterton and being startled into a sense of wonder, I was turned upside down, I thought, and to discover for the first time in my life, I was the right side up. And from this position, that I always thought was upside down, I could see the stars. No better description of conversion. So I want to finish. One thing, when you've been here for a while, we maybe get away with a little bit of self-indulgence, so you'll forgive me. But Father Wilde talked about the Sword of Surprise, one of Chesterton's great poems, and I'm going to brutalise the wonderful lines. But my favourite lines from that poem are where he says, "Give me miraculous eyes to see my eyes. Those terrible crystals made alive in me, more miraculous than all the things they see." Close, yeah. More miraculous than all the things they see. No, again, think about this. Give me eyes to see my eyes. You know, look at yourself in a way you hadn't looked at yourself before. Hang on, how do I not see anything? I see anything because these terrible crystals made alive in me that allow the beauties of the cosmos to flood into me, to allow the stars to be seen, to see things inside out, and give me eyes to see my eyes. But, something Chesterton also says, I think, in Orthodoxy, there's nothing further away from you than yourself. Everything in the cosmos is closer to you than yourself. Which is why relativism is, in some ways, the biggest and worst mysticism. It's the sort of mysticism that Ronald Knox spoke about when he said that mysticism begins in mist and ends in schism. Because we can't know ourselves. Ourselves are unfathomable. And if we want to know ourselves, we can only know ourselves by looking beyond ourselves, outside ourselves, to the cosmos, to the teachings of Christ, the life of His church, the life of grace, the sacraments, the examples of the saints, what it is to be a sinner, what it is to be a saint, knowing that we're homo viator, not homo sapiens, knowing that we're anthropos, we're meant to look up at the stars. The Sword of Surprise, Chesterton poem. There's another wonderful poem I'd like you to read when you get the chance. If you haven't read it, even if you have, read it again. By Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's written 200 years ago now, almost. And it's called Hymn Before Sunrise in the Vale of Chamonix. And here the poet is in the Swiss Alps. And the sun hasn't risen. And he's in the shadow of Mont Blanc, this huge mountain in the Swiss Alps. And all of a sudden, the sun begins to rise. And I can't do justice to the poem, that's why I'm asking you to read it. But basically everything, the mountain is crying God. The snow is crying God. The trees are crying God. The sun itself is crying God. The clouds are crying God. In looking at the stars, you see God in the beauty. And Jeremiah Hopkins, of course, whose philosophy was that we have to see the inscape of things, the divine presence, the presence of God in everything we see. As he says in this poem, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. More prosaically, J.R.R. Tolkien said, again in his essay on fairy stories, I think, he said, nature is a study for life, or eternity for those so gifted. Nature is a study for eternity for those so gifted. G.K. Chesterton was gifted to an extraordinary degree. Great poets like Chesterton, like Hopkins, like Coleridge. And this is all really just a way of leading you from the sublime to the ridiculous. Because I'm going to finish, if you don't mind, by reading a poem that I wrote about an experience of a real sunrise that I saw back in 1997, midsummer. I'm not making it plain it's a great poem, but I do think it is going to explain better than I'm going to be able to do it in words the essence of what I've been trying to say about looking at the stars. To do a little bit of context, the poem's only about 3 minutes long, so you can start exactly what you watch, it's not too long. But basically it was midsummer in England, so late June. In England, that time of year, it gets light about 4 a.m., about 4 o'clock in the morning. For some reason, I couldn't sleep. So I got up, went for a walk. I was living in the countryside. So at the back of my house was countryside. And it was still dark. It's the middle of the night. Everybody's asleep. 3:30, 3:45 in the morning. And I find myself in a field to just sit down. And the only sign of life is a hare, another creature. So there's an element of communion. Because we're awake, no one else is awake. And then I witnessed this astonishingly beautiful sunrise. And it sort of prefigured, of course, by the change in the colour of the sky. And then the sun rose. And the sun was white, pure white. You could look directly at it. And eventually it changed to red. And you could still look directly at it. And eventually it changed to gold, at which point you had to avert your gaze. So I saw in this, and it was a mystical vision, an image of the rosary. Obviously, first of all, the image of the white host rising. That's what I saw, the host rising. It's pure white disc. But the rosary, the white was the joyful mysteries. The red was the sorrowful mysteries. The gold was the glorious mysteries. All being shown to me by God. And the reason I'm convinced this was a mystical experience that evoked gratitude in me is this poem basically came to me. I spent very little time on it. Whole lines just poured into my mind. I just wrote them down. Which that happened more often. So, without further ado, having set the scene, I'll read it. It's called Solstice Sunrise. Deep in the dark night of the soul, something stirs. It is I, leaving dreams dreary whole as morning stars in summer sky. And ere sun rises from sleep to slumber and dawning of dawn, alone one rises in lazarine lumber to meet the morn, and the world sleeps. As gloaming fades, I stray and wander in gladdening glades, to pray and ponder of why, O visitor, impertinent impostor, inquisitive inquisitor, mumbling paternoster. In stillness to stare at solitary hair that accompanies my prayer. Does it know? Is it waiting? Is it, as I, anticipating? It knows that what it knows not. Distinctive but instinctive and oblivious of oblivion. Unconscious friar in Franciscan fraternity, the hair's breadth is the hair's breadth from here to eternity. And the world sleeps. And as the hare grassward grazes, without a care for heavenward gazes, something stirs. Clouds clustered in pagan grey turn a mythic, mystic rose. Heaven's heralds of the day, burning embers, amber glows, breeze through rushes, shh and hushes, in silent awe at a maiden's blushes, conceiving the sun. White he rises, and soul surmises, resplendent disguises, concealing the one. Corpus Christi, rising through the rose, sanguis Christi, skyward flows. Heavenly host, so new, so old, as Holy Ghost turns snow to gold. Joy to glory, tinged with sorrow, endless story, new tomorrow. Thus transfixed in transient transfiguration, the impressive impression of mind's gaze becomes expressive expression and finds praise. From deep draught of thought to prayer, tasting sweet living water there, divining divinity. But there are none so blind, blinded by the night, as they who will not see. They neither seek nor find, though reminded by the light. They are, but will not be. Yet as life exhales, passing the life sentence through the Lamb's loam, love's exiles, in repeated repentance, long for home. And world's renunciation wields annunciation, divining divinity. As choirs of angels, dressed as birds, sing songs of praise, too blessed for words, in finite infinity. And the world sleeps. Thank you.